Hi everyone, Professor Bowen here with some feedback on our Week 9 discussions. I hope that you've all enjoyed our lectures and readings dealing with translation and the globalization of sexology. I wanted to address some of the things that came in from last week's conversation around this. In your comments, many of you noted how sexology's spread all around the world led to its diversification, as social and cultural realities native to the various countries in which this new scientific field took root influenced the kinds of sexology practiced there. As we saw in our examination of India, China, and Russia, sexology had lots of national variants. In each of these countries, pre-existing traditions and phenomena shaped sexology's emergence and growth. And translation, as we saw, was one of the ways that this process of diversification happened. This is one of the ways we can see that sexology was not just a Western phenomenon. It's not as if peoples living outside of Europe and North America simply borrowed and copied down sexological concepts from these regions. Instead, they actively transformed these concepts. They adapted sexology to suit the concerns that were foremost in their minds. These examples from Russia, China, and India allow us to counter and combat the old diffusionist model of modern science, which was built on the idea that Western scientific knowledge slowly spread all around the world. Clearly, that's not what happened. Clearly, what happened was more complex than this, and sexology gives us an example of that process. But there is another, perhaps even more interesting way we can see sexology as a global phenomenon. As scholars of this subject argue, often the ideas that became part of Western sexology originated from abroad. We didn't actually get to talk about that many examples of this process in our readings, but some of you are wondering about it. And so in this video, I wanted to talk about one particular case where we can see sexological concepts from outside the West filtering back into the West and ultimately influencing Western understandings of sexuality. This case deals with Japan. Japan, like Russia and India and China, was one of the many countries that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, became quite interested in looking at sex and studying it from a scientific perspective. Japan's founding sexologists included researchers like Sueo Iwaya, Mori Ogai, Morita Yushu, and Keiji Doshi. In addition to having their own journals, one of which was simply called Sex, and publishing sexological studies in Japanese, many of these individuals were conversant in English and German, and at times they even published pieces in Western sexological journals. For example, in 1903, Sueo Iwaya published a piece called Pederasty in Japan in the German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld's journal, The Yearbook for Sexual Transitions. Iwaya and his colleagues also translated a number of Western sexological texts into Japanese. All of this worked to stimulate German interest in Japanese sexuality. In the early 20th century, many German researchers actually traveled to Japan, and while there, they met with and interacted with lots of their Japanese counterparts. Eventually, this dialogue led to some original Western scholarship on Japan. One good example of this is Friedrich Krauss's 1907 book, Sexual Life and the Beliefs, Morals, and Customs of the Japanese. As European investigators became more and more aware of the unique features of Japanese sexuality, they often incorporated the findings of Japanese sexologists into their own work. And there's probably no better example of this than in Magnus Hirschfeld's 1910 book, Transvestites, The Erotic Drive to Cross-Dress, which cited Sueo Iwaya's book on homosexuality quite extensively. According to Iwaya, Japan was home to two separate traditions of homosexuality. One of these was centered around the samurai. This was a model in which a strong brotherhood, as Iwaya put it, was forged between an adult and a younger pupil. And the second of these traditions centered on the theater, where certain young male actors, known as onagata, performed exclusively female roles on stage and were often taken as what Iwaya called passive lovers and treated as male geishas by other male actors. By the early 20th century, this was a long-standing tradition within Japanese kabuki theater and society more generally, and Hirschfeld read about it quite a lot from Iwaya's work. Hirschfeld actually changed his views on cross-dressing quite notably after reading Iwaya's studies. Initially, Hirschfeld had conceived of homosexuality as a sexual inversion. To be more specific, he thought of homosexuals as effeminate. But after learning about the onagata, he started to see things in a much more complex, nuanced way. We can see this from a chapter of his book that is called Cross-Dressing on the Stage. And here he talks about Japan. He talks about the onagata and how they are divided into three main types. He calls this first type, and I'm quoting here, completely normal men. That is, heterosexuals who engage in cross-dressing simply as a profession. The second group Hirschfeld calls homosexuals. That is, men who liked to dress like women and were attracted to other men. The third category is new. This is the category Hirschfeld calls transvestites, and he actually coined the term in 1910. This third category was a brand new term. In fact, yes, it was Hirschfeld who came up with the term transvestite, and he did so on the basis of his readings into Japanese sexology. As he had it, quote, transvestites were men who have a deep satisfaction in dressing as women, but who are sexually attracted only to women. As Hirschfeld came to believe, transvestitism was the result of what he called an irresistible urge to wear women's clothing, but it could be experienced by both homosexual and heterosexual men. As he put it in his book, quote, just as it is the case that not all homosexuals are effeminate, so too it is the case that not all effeminate people are homosexuals. As we can see from this statement, what Hirschfeld is doing here is severing sexuality from gender. This was something that came about, at least in part, from Western exposure to Japan, whose traditions had quite an impact on the way that Westerners understood themselves and their own sexualities. The category transvestite emerged out of discussions about Japanese sexuality, and it provides one pretty powerful example of how Western sexology was influenced by ethnographic reports from abroad. All right, that's all I wanted to say on this topic. I think this gives us hopefully an even broader understanding of sexology's travels through the East. If you have any questions about this or want some tips as to where you could go to read more about this particular subject, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Otherwise, I'll see you in the discussion board this week, where we're heading to the Middle East to talk about the development of sexology there. Thanks for watching and listening, everyone. Peace out.